Hi, I'm Tracy. I'm a reference librarian here at Mentor Public Library. I am interested in history and taking graduate level classes at Indiana University online. And I am doing my last lecture in the House of Windsor series. It's about Prince Philip. He was part of the royal family for around 70 years. So we're going to give a brief overview of his life, the 99 years he lived, and we're going to learn about what he did, different life stories, and accomplishments, as well as his duties. Prince Philip was born in Greece, in Corfu, in 1921. And just because he was born in Greece didn't mean he was Greek. He's actually German and Danish and a bit of Russian, but not Greek at all. And this is because his grandfather was actually invited to be king of Greece. He became George I. And that's because the throne was overthrown. It was a turbulent throne. It was actually looked down upon by other royals. And it was vacant at the time. So they invited the second son of the Danish king to come and be king. Philip also had a very turbulent life, but his parents, his mother Alice was the great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, and she was actually born at Windsor Castle in the UK. She was congenially deaf, and she was of the house Hesse-Darmstadt. She married Prince Andrew of Greece in 1903. Andrew was the fourth son of George I and Olga Konstantinova of Russia. He was of the house Schleswig, Holstein, Sonderburg, Glucksburg. And he, as a prince that wasn't going to inherit the throne, became a cavalry officer. Philip had 4 older sisters. The oldest one, Princess Margarita, was 18 years older than him. He also had Princess Theodora, Princess Cecily, who he was closest to, and Princess Sophie, who was 6 years older than he was. They all married very young to Germans. So in 1922, Philip, at 1 year old, was thrown into exile. His father was blamed for the defeat in the Turco-Greek War, and he also disobeyed orders in the army. So they were all banished, his father for life. And they were rescued by the British royal family on the HMS Calypso. Philip was actually put in an orange crate for the journey. And so he didn't go to the UK. None of them did. They were told, we'll give you a boat, we'll send you safe refuge, but you're not welcome here. So although they did rescue them, unlike they did with the Romanovs, they still were not welcome in the UK. So they settled in St. Cloud, north of Paris, and the house they were in was loaned by Andrew's brother, George, known as Big George, and his wife, Marie Bonaparte, who was a descendant of Napoleon. They traveled under Danish passports. Philip went to many schools throughout his education career. The first one was Elms, run by Donald McJanet in London. He said Philip was a know-it-all, but very polite. The second one, Cheam, was in Surrey. The third one, the Schule/Solemn, was partly run by Berthold Margrave of Baden, his brother-in-law, and husband of his sister Theodora. And the founder of the school, Kurt Hahn, happened to be Jewish. And this is in the 1930s when Nazi Germany came to power. And so Kurt Hahn ended up having to flee to Scotland. And he founds Gordonstone School, which Philip went to and sent his sons to. So during this period, the family breaks up. Philip has a lot of influence from his grandmother, Victoria of Milford Haven, and her husband Louis actually died the same year Philip was born. There was Uncle George, the second Marquess of Milford Haven, And his son was actually very close friends with Philip. His son David was actually best man at Philip's wedding. There was also Louis Mountbatten, first Earl of Mountbatten in Burma, but he isn't as big a figure as he will be later in Philip's life. So Philip had an attitude that kind of got him through everything in life. When asked about his family, he said, yes, my mother went to an institution, my father went to Monte Carlo with his mistress, my sisters got married, and I just had to get on with it. One does. So in the late 1930s, Philip really has some tragedy that he deals with. His sister, Cecile, and her husband, George Donatus, the hereditary Duke of Hesse, and their two sons are on their way to a wedding in London. And tragically, the plane hits a chimney, it's bad weather, it was trying to land, and it crashes in Ostend in Belgium. Further tragedy is Cecile is 8 months pregnant. And so there are so many factors in this. They actually figured out that probably Cecile was in labor, the plane was trying to land in terrible weather, and it hit a chimney and crashed. So the funeral was in Darmstadt, and Cecile and her husband had recently joined the Nazi Party. So you'll see in that photo brown shirts and Nazi uniforms. Philip's in the front row in a morning suit. He did not wear anything other than that. And he kept a wing of the plane with him. He was given a piece of the wreckage. And he actually kept it and showed it to very close friends of his as a reminder of her. And the next year, tragically, his uncle George, 2nd Marquess of Milford Haven, dies of bone marrow cancer in his mid-40s. So Philip went into the Royal Navy. His mother really wanted him to join the Greek Navy and eventually fight for Greece in World War II. He did not feel a connection to Greece at all at this point. He excelled at his Navy schooling. And in 1939, at the dawn of the war, he meets Princess Elizabeth. And she is actually with her parents and her sister Margaret when they come to visit the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. And Philip is the one left to entertain the two girls while all the adults are talking and going around and talking about the Navy. Philip doesn't really talk to Elizabeth that much. She's very shy at this point, though she is very interested and enamored in him. He ends up a lot of the time teasing Princess Margaret, who is much more outgoing than her older sister, though they do exchange letters after this meeting. Philip is promoted to a midshipman, and he was on the HMS Ramillies in the Indian Ocean. He ends up off the coast of India on the HMS Kent, and on the HMS Valiant in the Mediterranean. In 1941, he is promoted to sub-lieutenant. He participates in the Battle of Crete, the Battle of Matapan, where he used searchlights and was mentioned in dispatches. He was also on the HMS Wallis in Sicily as a first lieutenant, and he actually saved his ship from a night bombing. So a Nazi airplane comes and bombs the side of the ship. It is Philip's idea that with a flotation device and some smoke, they can deter the ship away from them, and they'll start bombing the flotation device. That actually worked, so the ship got away, and they were not bombed again. So they were saved from the night bombing. Later on in the war, in 1945, he was on the HMS Whelp, brand new boat in the Pacific, and the 27th Flotilla Naval Fleet. He actually saw the surrender, so he used his binoculars from the boat to be able to see the surrender. Philip did have a number of engagement. He did have his engagement with Princess Elizabeth, but he also had a suitor beforehand, and there were many girls that were interested in Philip. One girl he dated was Osla Benning, and she was in naval intelligence. She was also Canadian, and they dated in the early part of World War II. They were introduced by Philip's uncle, Louis Mountbatten, and Oslo would later say, "I fell in love with a naval officer." She never used a name, but it's assumed that it is Philip. And they drifted apart in the second half of the war, and she actually married John Henniker Major in 1946. Especially close to the end of the war, he became close to Elizabeth. He was often at Windsor Castle. He had nowhere to go. He actually did not have a fixed home. He just went with whatever relative would take him at a given time. And his sister Patricia had a guest book where he signed it in his cousin's guest book, "No fixed abode," for his address. And so he wrote letters to Elizabeth every week towards the end of the war. And it was actually his mother that got the engagement ring in London. They didn't want anyone to know what was going on. They wanted it to be a private moment, not with the press intrusion or anything like there is now. So his mother went to the jeweler to make a ring used from diamonds from his mother's tiara. And there was one large stone flanked by 10 diamonds. And the rest of the jewels that weren't used were used for an Art Deco bracelet. And he proposed at Balmoral Palace in 1946. He said he really didn't have any interest or imagination of proposing until 1946. So he wrote to his mother-in-law, or soon-to-be mother-in-law, soon after the engagement. And he said, "To have been spared in the war and seen victory, to have been given chance to rest and to readjust myself, to have fallen in love completely and unreservedly, makes all one's personal and even world's troubles seem small and petty." He made a lot of sacrifices before the marriage. He was baptized in the Greek Orthodox Church, but he became Anglican. He renounced his titles of Greece and Denmark. He became a naturalized British subject. And he waited for Elizabeth's 21st birthday, like her father requested, to announce the engagement. And this was a very controversial engagement. Some courtiers looked down on the Greek royal family. People were very unhappy about his German relations. So they just overall were not too keen on it. Another person that was not a fan of Philip was Elizabeth's mother's brother, John Bowes-Lyon, and he was very vocal about it with his sister. He said, "Not really sure Philip's the right person for this kind of life." And it kind of rubbed off onto Elizabeth's mother. She is known to have called him the Hun in private. They did get along together, but in private, they had their moments, and Philip kind of knew to stay out of her way in family discussions. So at the wedding, November 20th, 1947, Elizabeth had a lot of family there and a lot of friends and relations, but Philip only had his mother. His father had died during World War II. He had some of his uncles and cousins, one which was a bridesmaid, Pamela Mountbatten, and one who was his best man, David Marquess of Milford Haven. His sisters were not allowed to come because of their German relations. They were very upset about this. They brought it up from time to time after the fact for a very long time. They were very disappointed, especially his sister Sophie, who had been married the year before, and Philip had come to her wedding and been invited to it. It was her second marriage because her first husband was actually killed in the war. So Philip gave up smoking for the princess. She saw the effect that it was having on her father, and she didn't want her husband smoking. So he gave it up cold turkey. He wore his naval uniform to the wedding. He cut the cake with his sword and was also made Knight of the Most Noble Order of the Garter and wore his war medals. And they had their honeymoon at Burke Hall and the Broadlands. Not all of it was very private. People from all over really wanted to see them. At the wedding, he was made Duke of Edinburgh. He was not given a prince title, but he was also made Baron Greenwich and Earl of Mariannhill. Philip took a desk job at the Admiralty after his marriage. In 1948, the Duke and the Princess had their first state visit, and that was to France. In 1948, supporting the Queen and King, they met state officials. They went to the Élysée Palace to a state banquet. They were mainly there to open 8 centuries of British life in the Galleria Museum, and they went to the reception as well. There was also an opera performance. They saw a race course, and they had lunch at the Canadian Embassy. Philip, had his first 2 children in 1948 and 1950, Prince Charles and Princess Anne. They were very different children, and these were the 2 children that actually got to know Elizabeth's grandmother and father. But they had very different stories about their childhood. Charles had a habit in the 1990s complaining about his childhood, saying his father was a cold and not loving to him, mentioning that his mother had made no time for him. But Anne was always very different. She said that her parents loved her, she had fond memories of them growing up, and still did. So they had very different ways of looking at it, but they also had very different personalities. So in a way, if you're looking at it from that perspective, it might be not as surprising. And so Philip and Elizabeth enjoyed a time for normalcy as well as it could have been in 1949 to 1951 when he was stationed in Malta. He was on the HMS Checkers of the 1st Destroyer Flotilla. He was also a lieutenant commander of Magpie and eventually became a commander. This was a time where they could actually enjoy time as she would as a Navy wife and him being in the Navy. Unfortunately, it doesn't last very long. In 1951, in July, the king is very ill, and they're actually called back to the UK. So his Navy career is effectively over. When asked what he felt about ending his Navy career, if he was upset about it, he said, well, it was inevitable. And so they returned and took on many royal duties. The king and queen were no longer doing overseas trips. So it was left to them to do the Canada tour. So in 1951, they toured all over Canada. And at the Montreal airport, they were met by 15,000 people. And in Quebec City, there were 2,500 armed guards that made sure at all times people were 30 feet away from Elizabeth and Philip. They spent 33 days on the tour, and Philip was asked to autograph a football, but security rushed in and made sure they deflated that football before he signed it, because there might have been something in it. So cities in Canada really tried to outdo other cities. Who would do the biggest balls and who would spend the most money on decorations. And they also had a little U.S. excursion where they met President Harry Truman. And Harry Truman brought his mother-in-law to meet the princess. She's a bit elderly and confused at this point. He says, "Ma, I have for you Princess Elizabeth. I brought her here to meet you." And she says, "Oh, I'm so glad to meet you. I'm so glad your father was just reelected." And no, her father was in a position as king for life. He was not reelected. But guess what? Winston Churchill just was. So that's what she's thinking of. They actually left by ship, and they both were appointed to the Privy Council after their successful tour. They also had a tour of the Commonwealth. So they were going to Kenya, and they were also going to go to Australia and New Zealand. They got to Kenya, and they went to Sagana Lodge, which they got as a wedding present. And they only arrived on February 1st. There was a lot of waving and cheering children. They saw warthogs, baboons, rhinos, and they slept in the treetops, in Treetops Hotel. Unfortunately, on February 6th, Elizabeth's father passes away. And it took a while for the royal entourage to realize that the princess's, now queen's, father had died. The acronym for his death was Hyde Park Corner. They never got that message. So the telegram must have been rerouted to literally the address of Hyde Park Corner. So Martin Charteris, Elizabeth's private secretary, happens to turn on the TV and see what had happened. And so he immediately phones Philip and says what happened, and Philip is the one responsible for giving her the news of her father's death. And according to Philip's equerry, Mike Parker, it just looked like the whole world fell on him. So he took her out to the garden, and he told her what happened and that she was now queen. They talked for a long period of time, mainly Philip talking, but she stayed very calm. So Philip participated in George VI's funeral. He walked in the family procession with the Duke of Gloucester, the Duke of Windsor, and the Duke of Kent. The Duke of Kent is actually the only person to walk in the 1952 funeral and the 2002 funeral. So he's also responsible for consoling the family, especially the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret. The Queen and he thanked the Reverend. And it's around this time that people are wondering what the house name is going to be. And Philip's uncle, Louis Mountbatten, actually starts talking about how it might be House Mountbatten at one of the parties he's giving. And Elizabeth really wasn't going to change the name, but her, and specifically grandmother and mother, did not want the name changed. It was actually Elizabeth, grandmother's Mary's husband, George V, that changed the name to the House of Windsor, and they really wanted it set that way. Philip was interested in changing the name, and Elizabeth decided in April of 1952 to keep it as Windsor. Philip was very upset. He said, "I am the only man in this country not allowed to give his name to his children. I'm nothing but a bloody amoeba." And his cousin, Patricia Mountbatten, actually said that he was very hurt as well as angry, and that hurt lasted a very long time. Some of his early duties were the Freemasonry, which was actually his father-in-law's originally. He took flying lessons and became certified to fly. And he also was in charge of the household. So Elizabeth and Philip kind of had flipped-flopped positions. So Philip was in charge of the household, he was in charge of the children, making sure the palaces ran smoothly, and Elizabeth was the one working and doing royal duties, and the sovereign. They made it pretty clear that they didn't want Philip involved, especially the courtiers and her advisors. They pretty much iced him out and kept him in his place immediately. And he just said, I had to find something else to do to keep myself useful. And one of those things was chairing the Coronation Commission. So Elizabeth was coronated on June 2nd, 1953. And he's there to support the Queen, but he also helped plan the coronation. it was him who suggested the television and putting the event on TV so everybody could see it and access it. And there was a huge TV boom of people buying TVs right before the coronation. He was actually the second person to pay homage to the Queen. He said, "I, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, do become your liegeman of life and limb, of earthly worship, and faith and truth. I bear unto you to live and die against all manner of folks, so help me God." And he also rode in the stagecoach with her and waved on the balcony. But there was a little tiff between him and the photographer during the coronation. He made things difficult for Cecil Beaton, who was the Queen Mother's photographer. So, according to Beaton, Philip put a smile that put the fear of God in him. Philip really wanted his friend Barron from his Thursday lunch club with him and his equerry, Mike Parker, to take the photographs. Barron had been taking some royal photographs lately, and Philip was really upset he didn't get the job. And the Queen and Queen Mother were absolutely horrified at Philip's not really great behavior. During the photographs, it got bad enough that Beaton actually wanted to give him the camera and say, "Why don't you take them?" But he did not. He refrained. So the Queen ended up mentioning Philip in her broadcast to the nation, and she said, "He shares all my ideals and affections for you." So his primary job was to support the Queen, and he helps this really shy, sometimes timid Queen open up. Sometimes she's a little too reserved, and so he'll crack a joke, and she will be more at ease with whoever she's trying to speak to or whatever speech she's trying to give. So his first venture was the Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme, and it's inspired by Kurt Hahn. So boys, now both boys and girls, but it started off just boys, at 14 to 24, could do outdoor adventures and community service to get an award. And Kurt Hahn said it puts young people in situations that challenge them physically and mentally and have goodwill between each other, and it saves us from war. The Duke of Edinburgh put together groups of people that probably wouldn't engage so much otherwise and would not have really come in contact with each other. It took 1 to 4 years to complete by their 25th birthday. So they could do a physical activity, volunteering, or practical social skills and take part in an expedition. If you wanted a gold award, there's the level of bronze, silver, and gold. For gold, you would be staying away from home, doing a shared activity. It only required 1 hour per week for 3 to 6 months if you wanted bronze, 6 to 9 months if you wanted silver, or 12 to 18 months if you wanted gold. Today, over 144 nations participate. The Royal Yacht Britannia was in commission from 1954 to 1997, and it was the 83rd vessel since Charles II in 1666. And it was intended for the Queen and Duke of Edinburgh to take refuge off the coast of Scotland. They had royal officers appointed for up to 2 years, and it was used on Commonwealth tours, trips to the US, and their children, Anne and Charles, used it for their honeymoons. It was retired in 1994, and you can actually tour it now. Their first official visit was in 1954, and it was the Commonwealth tour. It was the originally promised tour to Australia and New Zealand, and she was the first monarch to go there, and it was a very long tour. It was actually 6 months, And from the 24th of November in 1953 in Bermuda, they stayed only a day and went to St. Peter's Church. They went to Jamaica and attended a dinner at the King's house. And they waved to large clouds in an open Land Rover. They landed in Fiji on the 17th of December, and they saw traditional dances and singing. They had a welcoming in Albert Park and Suva. They actually flew to Tonga and met their royal family. They saw the war memorial and had a feast of roast pigs, chicken, yams, and native fruits. They had a banquet with a long row table. However, they sat on the floor. They spent Christmas in New Zealand, and it was the first time the Queen would remark in a speech, "My husband and I." And she often said this just because her husband was part of her life and he was included, but also because of how important it was for a woman to be married in the 1950s. And she wanted to distinguish herself from her predecessor, Elizabeth I, who was the Virgin Queen and never married. So they went to the government house, and they would return many times. They stayed in Australia for 8 weeks in early February. They were there for 58 days, and they visited 57 towns and cities, including Sydney, Victoria, Tasmania, and Canberra. They went to the Cocos Islands and saw dance and model boats. They went to Sri Lanka on a train ride. In Uganda, they saw cheering people who lined the streets, and she toured Kazinga National Park. They also went to Malta for the War Memorial in Valletta, and the Royal Yacht Britannia actually docked there. She met the 2 children, and on the 10th of May, the tour ended in Guildborough, and they went to Eliot's monument as a family and planted a tree, and the kids fed apes. So Philip had a tour of his own in the 1950s. On the 22nd of November in 1956, he actually opened the Melbourne Olympic Games, and it was the first Olympic Games south of the equator. He also had an Arctic expedition, and he joined the Order of the Red Nose. He traveled over 40,000 miles, saw wildlife, and visited with the Delhi penguins. He loved native seabirds and took a lot of photos. But this tour was not without controversy. His equerry, Mike Parker, was in the middle of a divorce, and his wife actually filed during the tour. And it created a lot of controversy in the papers. She never wanted to be in royal life or close to it at all, and this was her way to get out. Philip was also branded for this long tour as a bad father, and there were rumors that he and the Queen were separating. They didn't like each other at all, and that's why he was staying away from her so long. There were just a lot of rumors, and this was the only time that the Queen would ever issue a statement about her marriage, saying it was fine. She also responded a few months later in her own way by creating the Duke of Prince. He finally got his prince title back. So the Queen has been pleased by the letters patent under the Great Seal of the Realm, bearing the date 22nd of February, 1957, to give and grant unto His Royal Highness, the Duke of Edinburgh, the style and titular dignity of a Prince of the United Kingdom and Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Over his life, Philip was president, patron, or honorary member of 992 organizations. He enjoyed science, technology, young people, educating people with conservation, environmental issues, and encouraging sports. He was first president in the World Wildlife Fund from 1961 to 1982. He was the international president from 1981 to 1996, and the president emeritus until his death. He was president of the Fields and Trust from 1947 to 2013. And he also was involved in the British Heart Association for 6 decades. He also established the Prince Philip Designers Prize in 1959 for people who did projects on engineering and graphics. Philip and the Queen's second set of children were born in the 1960s, Andrew in 1960 and Edward in 1964. So Edward's daughter, coincidentally, Lady Louise, was the first to hold the surname of Mountbatten Windsor. And these 2 children were treated differently than the first set of children that the prince and the queen had. They were much more set in their roles. It was easier for them to balance their duties as parents and as royals. They also were older, so they really doted on this set of children. In 1967, Philip's mother was invited by the Queen to come live at Buckingham Palace. The right-wing militia came in power after a coup, and she was exiled again. And her life was really dedicated to service and charity, and that was inspired by her aunt. And she lived at Buckingham for 2 years. She died on December 5th in 1969. She was initially buried in St. George's Chapel, but she always wanted to be in the convent of St. Mary Magdalene in Jerusalem, and she was interred there in 1988. She also is a righteous of the nations. She sheltered a Jewish family during World War II, and actually the Nazis came to her house and she pretended not to be able to hear them. She used her deafness as an excuse to not understand at all what they were saying. They actually went away and never came back. She kept in touch with the Cohen family after the war. So in 1969, Philip has an idea of a royal family movie. It doesn't really turn out to be one of his finer ideas. Unfortunately, because he tries to make the royal family look normal, and that is not possible. So he was accused for revealing too much about the family. One of the things that many people love so much about the royals is how much you don't know about them. So it was a year in the life of the Queen and the royal family. It took 18 months to film. They showed scenes of lunch, gardening parties, buying ice cream, watching TV, and a discussion between the Queen and the Home Secretary, which doesn't somehow scream normal to me. It was banned in 1977, but it was watched by 38 million viewers, and it sold around the world 350 million copies. It's actually available for anybody to watch on YouTube. So Philip had several hobbies. He enjoyed polo, carriage driving, reading. He had a library with thousands of books, many of them on conservation, science, technology, history, and religion. And he got his pilot's license in the 1960s. He was the first person to fly a helicopter over Buckingham Palace. He also enjoyed sailing. Philip, over the years, had several faux pas and was known for gaffes or inappropriate comments over the years. Some of them are a little bit cringeworthy, but I will go with 3 of them. In 1986, someone asked how a tour of China was going, and he said, ghastly. And then he told a student, Simon Kirby, that if you stay here much longer, you'll go home slitty-eyed. Well, and he also said on an Australian Aboriginal visit after a dance to the dancers, do you still throw spears at each other in 2002? And then he told the Nigerian Prime Minister in 2003, while he was wearing his traditional robes, "You look as if you're getting ready for bed." Yes, so those are 3 examples, and that people have been remembering. So after those laughs, we have a sad story. So on August 27th, 1979, on the Shadow 5, Louis Mountbatten's boat, there was the IRA, Irish Republican Army, planted a bomb on their boat. So on Donegal Bay off the Ireland's northwest coast, the bomb exploded. The IRA wanted to drive the British out of Northern Ireland and wanted to unite Northern and Southern Ireland. Later that day, a bombing attack on land killed 18. So Louis Mountbatten was killed that day along with his grandson, Nicholas Knatchbull, his daughter Patricia's mother-in-law, Baroness Brayborn, and the fisherman boy hired help, Paul Maxwell. And Philip always called this event a senseless act of terrorism. Countess Mountbatten Patricia was hospitalized for several days. She had over 100 stitches in her face, including her eyes. She called it her IRA facelift. So, although Philip had 2 son-in-laws, I'm only going to talk about the daughters-in-law. So first we have Diana that was married to Charles from 1981 to 1996. Originally, she and Philip got along very well, and it was because they were both outsiders in the royal family. He really understood and was sympathetic with how she might be feeling as an outsider in the family. And when it came out that Charles had had the affair with Camilla, he wrote to her that had never entered their heads, and he was horrified. But he continued to write and ask her what she could have done differently for the next time, and criticized her for her own affairs. So she just felt at some point he was too critical. And his son Andrew married Sarah Ferguson. They were married from 1986 to 1996. Sarah calls Philip wise but terrifying. And he initially knew her family. Her father, Major Ronald Ferguson, was also into polo, and he knew Philip from that. Had an interest in aviation. But there was one scandal that Philip could not get over. That was the Saint-Tropez incident in France, where Sarah was seen having her toes sucked by John Bryan, her financial advisor, and she was exiled by Philip, and he never forgave her. He never really had any interest in talking to her again or keeping contact. But there was one, the wives he did get along with permanently, and that was Sophie. She was originally the Duchess of Essex, and she was interested in horses, carriages, and she was a big help to her parents in the latter years. And 1992 was really a horrible year for not only the Queen, but Prince Philip as well. All of their children, except for one, separates or divorces. Diana comes out with her book about her story, and the electric bulb close to the curtains during a rewiring project at Windsor Castle sets it on fire on their 45th wedding anniversary. And so 115 rooms, 9 staterooms were affected. The fire lasted over 15 hours, and it was miraculous that only 2 works of art were lost. Most of them had been put into storage by that point, and Philip actually headed the renovation project. He even included a small chapel for the Queen. This was when they needed to raise $47 million in damage, So they opened up Buckingham Palace for visitors. And later, a year after his death, there was an exhibit, Philip, a celebration, that talked about his renovation projects on Windsor Castle and included a burnt wood beam. In 1997, on August 31st, Princess Diana was unfortunately killed in a car accident after a high-speed car chase in Paris. And so Diana's children were at Balmoral when this happened with their grandparents. And as grandparents would, they would not let them go to London. They did not want them to see the press or media attention, how the public was reacting over the death. And Anne actually brought her children up to Balmoral. And Philip kept the boys occupied as much as possible. He tried to keep them in the same routine, but he did offer hikes and other activities to keep them occupied. During the funeral arrangements, Philip was heard barking a few times, "It's about the boys," during the funeral arrangements, as he did not seem to like how it was going. Well, it turns out that Prince William had expressed that he didn't really want to walk in the procession, and he was unsure. And Philip's response to that was, "I'll walk if you walk." And Philip wasn't really supposed to be in the procession. He didn't have a really big reason to be, but he was there for his grandsons that day. Philip overall had 8 grandchildren. Today they have a wide spread in age, about 30 years. The oldest one is 45, and the youngest one is 15. And many of them have children of their own. Philip was always very interested in his Russian heritage, and it turns out that he's related to Russian royalty on both sides. His grandmother had a sister who married into the Russian royal family. She was Tsarina Alex, of the Romanovs that were murdered in July of 1918. And Philip's other grandmother was originally from the Russian royal family. So by the 1990s, Philip is the closest relative to the Romanovs. And Philip decides he wants to help solve this Russian royal mystery. In 1991, 5 bodies were found, and it could have been some of the Romanovs. Philip gave his DNA to see if they were, if it was a match, and the results were sealed for a number of years. In 2007, 2 more bodies were found close to the house where they were murdered, and Philip's DNA was used again. And the answer to both questions is yes. So Philip contributed to solving a royal mystery. Some of you might be wondering when I'm going to talk about if Philip did or didn't have affairs with other women or mistresses. One of them was the famous actress Pat Kirkwood. 1948, they met at a French restaurant and then danced the night away and had breakfast together. There were a lot of rumors about this, and Philip never commented on them. Elizabeth's father, George VI, was furious, and Pat Kirkwood's family was really not happy that Philip didn't comment on it. But royalty never really does have a comment very often. So there was also Penny Romsey, the wife of his grandson, the grandson of John and Patricia Knatchbull. They were 30 years difference in age, but they loved horses and carriage drivings. She was the one of 30 mourners at his funeral in 2021. But the Queen was also close to her and took her to church often. And that might have been the Queen's way of saying we're friends too. There was Sacha Abercorn, close friends, and she said it was a passionate friendship, but it didn't go beyond that. He was often seen at her house in Barons Court and with carriage driving. And according to Dickie Arbiter, Philip looked around a lot, but he never bought. So On Philip's last engagement, that was in 2017, it was his 22,219th engagement. He was 95, and it was with the Royal Marines. He tipped his bowler hat after receiving the royal salute, and then he walked off into the palace. He was once asked if he wanted to live to be 101 like his mother-in-law, and he said, absolutely not. I'm already falling to pieces as it is. Bits keep dropping off. I have absolutely no desire to cling on to life unnecessarily. Ghastly prospect. And he retired to Wood Farm on Sandringham. It was not too close to the Queen. She was often at Windsor or Buckingham doing official business. And Wood Farm is sort of like a cottage. It's cottage style and it's 5 bedrooms. He actually moved closer to the Queen during COVID to be in her bubble. So some of his last portraits and memories, his last portrait was done by Ralph Hymans in 2021. He is actually in the corridor near where his mother and grandmother were born. They were born by behind the door in the back of the painting. And he actually stayed in that room during COVID into his death. And he also wore, his sash was the Order of the Elephant of the Danish Royal Family Award for Chivalry. His last public wedding was his cousin Marina of Greece's great-granddaughter Gabriella Windsor's wedding. And his last wedding total was his granddaughter Beatrice's lockdown COVID wedding. She actually wore the Queen's dress from 1947 and reworked it to her own style. When asked about what's going to happen to the monarchy in the future, if he had any insight, he said there will be ups and downs, but beyond that I have no idea what the future holds. There's no point in speculating about it. All I'll say is that I've tried to keep it going while I've been here. So he died on April 9th, 2021. His death was announced at noon, and when asked about seeing him for the last time, his daughter-in-law Sophie said, his death was just so gentle, like someone took him by the hands and he went. At 6 p.m., Westminster Abbey tolled every minute for 99 minutes. The flags were ordered to be at half-mast until the day of the funeral. Philip thought that in the event that he was reincarnated, he would like to return as a deadly virus to contribute something to solving overpopulation. And so condolences poured in upon his death, and Operation Fourth Bridge, his carrying out his death and funeral, were in full play. Since it was COVID, there were only 30 mourners allowed. And he was initially in the royal vault until the death of the Queen, and then they were moved together to their vault, the chapel with Elizabeth's parents. The funeral was televised, and he got the same level of honors as Princess Diana and the Queen Mother. His coffin was carried in a custom-built Land Rover Defender in Edinburgh Green, which he actually designed himself, and it was lined by the household cavalry, foot guards, and military detachment units. The coffin was draped in his personal royal standard. On his coffin was a cap and sword, and also a wreath of white roses and lilies, and that was from the Queen. He was surrounded by a band of grenadier guards who led the procession from the quadrangle to Horseshoe Cloister, followed by the military commanders and staff. He had his 4 children and grandchildren, his nephews, son-in-law, and staff walk behind the coffin. Then the Queen came by limo with a lady-in-waiting. And there were the Royal Navy Marines, Highlanders, 4th Battalion, Royal Regiment of Scotland, and the Royal Air Force, The King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery fired the guns, and there was the Duke's driving carriage pulled by his fell ponies, and it stood in the quadrangle with his cap, wig, whip, and gloves on the carriage seat. He had 8 pallbearers from the household cavalry. They did a guard of honor while playing the national anthem, and followed by a minute's silence. There were 730 military personnel, and the Dean of Windsor did the service, the insignia, the honors, and declarations by the Commonwealth Field Marshal. And he gave the Danish Order of the Elephant, the Greek Order, and the Redeemer. There were no eulogies. There were simple songs and poems. And after it was finished, they all said, "God save the Queen." An interesting part of his funeral was that he requested his sister's descendants attend the funeral. And they did come from Germany. They quarantined ahead of time at his special request. And Philip's legacy is that he was the first royal to fly over Buckingham Palace, and he created a dynasty. He actually created part of the rule book for carriage driving as a sport. He did the Duke of Edinburgh award schemes. He did his own paintings. He was down to earth. He was a symbol of stateability and modernization. The Queen once said in 1997, "He has simply been my strength and stay all these years, and I and his whole family and this and many other countries owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim or we shall ever know." And his final wish was granted on March 10th, 2023, when Prince Edward was given the Duke of Edinburgh title. And thank you for coming. If you have any questions, just let me know.